I was asked by a couple people in good faith to read and comment on this entire article. I had previously chosen not to read the more disturbing details of the article because within the 24-hour TikTok news cycle, that's what people come looking for. And a lot of people in my video were upset because I wasn't giving the tea. And I find it really disturbing. And thank you to the several people that pointed that out also. But I find it really disturbing that the horrific assault and abuse of women is considered tea. So hopefully by the time I post this, all of those people are gone and we can actually have a productive discussion while reading the article in its entirety. All right, without further ado, let's get into it. The article is called There Is No Safe Word: How the Best-Selling Fantasy Author Neil Gaiman Hid the Darkest Parts of Himself for Decades. It's written by Lila Shapiro, a features writer for New York Magazine. Thank you, Lila, for your amazing investigative work on this. And the editor's note says the story contains content that readers may find disturbing, including graphic allegations of SA. Scarlett Pavlovich was a 22-year-old drama student when she met the performer Amanda Palmer by chance on the streets of Auckland. It was a gray, drizzly afternoon in June 2020, and Palmer, then 44, was walking down the street with the actress Lucy Lawless, one of the most famous people in New Zealand owing to her 6-season stint portraying Xena the Warrior Princess. But Pavlovich noticed only Palmer. She'd watched her TED Talk, The Art of Asking, and was fascinated by the cult-famous feminist writer and musician, by her unabashed self-assurance. On the surface, Pavlovich appeared to be self-assured as well. A local girl, she had dropped out of high school at 15 to travel to Europe, Morocco, and the Middle East on the cheap, pausing in Scotland, where Tilda Swinton gave her a scholarship to attend her Steiner School drum duon. Now, y'all, I'm just doing my best, okay? And London to work in the cabaret scene. Eventually, her visa expired and she ran out of money, and so in 2019, she returned to Auckland where she enrolled in an acting school and took a job at a perfumery. Pale and dark-haired and waifish, she favored bold colors and outrageous outfits. On the day she met Palmer, on most days then, she'd painted a triangle of translucent silver beneath her lower lashes, so it looked as though she'd been crying tears of glitter. It was Pavlovich who approached Palmer on the sidewalk outside the perfumery. She was surprised when Palmer texted her a few days later. "It's Amanda D. Palmer," she wrote, "your new friend." Palmer, an obsessive chronicler of her own life in songs, poems, blog posts, and a memoir, got her start as half of the punk cabaret band, the Dresden Dolls, but she is perhaps more famous for her ability to attract a tight-knit and devoted following wherever she goes. In 2012, she became the first musician to raise more than $1 million on Kickstarter, and later became one of Patreon's most successful artists. As Palmer explained in her book The Art of Asking, part memoir, part manifesto, on the virtues of asking for assistance of various kinds. She had built her entire career on messy exchanges of goodwill and the swapping of favors. Out of this mess, she argued, a utopian sort of community formed. There was no distinction between fans and friends. I'm going to be honest, I haven't done too much research on Amanda Palmer. I'm not like a built-in fan. I don't know about her band or her community or anything like that. But I do believe that exchange-based communities can work. I believe that they work best among women. And this story is going to be a wonderful example of why you should never get men involved in such ventures. Leave them out of it. Over the following year and a half, Palmer and Pavlovich occasionally met for a drink or a meal. Palmer offered Pavlovich tickets to her shows and invited her to parties for the Patreon community at her house on nearby Waiheke Island, a lush bohemian retreat with vineyards, golden beaches, and more than 60 helipads to accommodate the billionaires who vacationed there. Sometimes Palmer asked Pavlovich for favors, help running errands or organizing files or looking after her child. Pavlovich was happy to assist. She had a crush on Palmer. She didn't mind that Palmer only occasionally discussed paying her, even though Pavlovich was always strapped for cash. For Pavlovich, who was estranged from her family and without a safety net, Palmer filled a deeper need. In November 2020, Palmer invited her to hang out at her place for a weekend with a group of local artists. At the gathering, Palmer asked Pavlovich to babysit while she got a massage. Early the next morning, Pavlovich wrote a diary entry about the easy intimacy she'd felt in Palmer's sun-drenched home, where she'd read to Palmer's son, who was 5 at the time, their limbs intertwined. The years absent of touch build up like a gray inheritance, she wrote. I am hungry. I am so fucking famished. And know that this is exactly the state that these dangerous predators will find you in. And trust me, they can sniff it out on you from a mile away. They know that you're desperate for touch and connection and intimacy and all of that. That's why my biggest advice to women will always be work on yourself to get yourself past that stage as soon as you can. Because the longer that you remain in that yearning, that approval, acceptance needing stage, the longer that people like this will continue to take advantage of you by offering you false intimacy in the form of servitude to them. That's when they'll play you the hardest. Women can be predators too. So please keep that in mind. On February 1st, 2022, Palmer texted Pavlovich and asked if she wanted to spend the weekend babysitting, which would mean bouncing back and forth between her house and her husband's. So this is where we actually are going to be introduced to the man whom this article is about, and that's Neil Gaiman. He is a very famous fantasy writer. He may be more well known among the Gen X crowd or the elder millennial crowd, because he was also really huge on Tumblr and then subsequently Twitter in its early days. This is also sort of like a very niche community, so if you haven't heard about him, don't be surprised. The reason that this is a big deal is because as far as authors go, he really did have a higher level of fame than most writers ever get to. He was able to leverage his charisma, his online presence, all of those things very well in order to establish himself as like a safe person, a feminist, an outspoken like justice warrior, as a very kind and like generous with his time type of guy. You'll be able to see exactly how power hungry he was later on, but this is exactly why he did all of those things to have that big social media following. And as we'll see in the statement that he has released, since all of this latest round of allegations came out, he is definitely going to try and gaslight all of us collectively about exactly what happened here. Even though all of these women's stories make perfect sense and align with everything that he's ever let on about himself as a person. Pavlovich had never met Palmer's husband, from whom she was separated, though of course she knew who he was. Neil Gaiman, the acclaimed British fantasist and author of nearly 50 books, including American Gods and Coraline and the comic book series The Sandman, whose work has sold more than 50 million copies worldwide. Gaiman and Palmer had arrived in New Zealand in March 2020, but just weeks later, their 9-year marriage collapsed, and Gaiman skipped town, breaking COVID protocols to fly to his home on the Isle of Skye. Now he had returned and was living in a house near Palmer's on Waiheke. Their previous nanny had recently left and they needed help. Pavlovich agreed and was pleased when Palmer offered to pay her for the weekend's work. Around 4 in the afternoon on February 4, Pavlovich took the ferry from Auckland to Waiheke, then sat on a bus and walked through the woods until she arrived at Gaiman's house, an asymmetrical A-frame of dark, burnished wood with picture windows overlooking the sea. Palmer had arranged a play date for the child, so not long after Pavlovich arrived, she found herself alone in the house with the author. For a little while, Gaiman worked in his office while she read on the couch. Then he emerged and offered her a tour of the grounds. A striking figure at 61, his wild black curls threaded with strands of silver, the author picked a fig, her favorite fruit, and handed it to her. Around 8 p.m., they sat down for pizza. Gaiman poured Pavlovich a glass of rosé, and then another. He drank only water. Clock that. They made awkward conversation about New Zealand, about COVID. Pavlovich had never read any of his work, but she was anxious to make a good impression. After she'd cleaned up their plates, which why was she doing that? She's there to babysit, not clean up plates, but okay. Gaiman noted that there was still time before they would have to pick up his son from the play date. I've had a thought, she recalls him saying. Why don't you have a bath in the beautiful claw bathtub in the garden? It's absolutely enchanting. Pavlovich told Gaiman that she was fine, as she was, but ultimately agreed, which means he kept pressing. He needed to make a work call, he said, and didn't want Pavlovich to be bored. Gaiman led Pavlovich down a stone path into the garden to an old-fashioned tub with a roll top and walked away. She got undressed and sank into the bath, looking up at the furry magenta blossoms of the Pahutukawa tree overhead. A few minutes later, she was surprised to hear Gaiman's footsteps on the stone in the dark. She tried to cover her breasts with her arms. When he arrived at the bath, she saw that he was naked. Gaiman put out a couple of citronella candles, lit them, and got into the bath. He stretched out facing her and for a few minutes made small talk. He bitched about Palmer's schedule. He talked about his kid's school. Then he told her to stretch her legs out and get comfortable. So you're telling me this is this woman's first time at his house. This is a young woman, right? She's 22 years old. This is a man in his 50s, inviting her out of nowhere at a babysitting session to get naked and get into the tub. Just so you know, men will do this. And I hate to share this, but in the interest of boosting the case that women don't just make this shit up for fun, I'll tell y'all, I had a boss when I was very young. So I was like 20, 21, and I had this boss who out of nowhere brought me to a tanning salon and insisted that I get a spray tan. And I said no, I'm not joking. I said no like 100 times. And he kept insisting and would not leave the salon. Like, he drove us there. It was the single weirdest, most horrifying, awkward experience of my entire life. Later on, he kept doing things that were very uncomfy. He definitely abused his position of power in that way. Yeah, he wasn't even a bajillionaire like Neil Gaiman. There was no beautiful bathtub, nothing like that. Men just like to play these little power games, especially with young, impressionable women, which is what I was at the time. I was a married woman, by the by, and he knew this. And I think it was just a power play on so many levels. And this is why I don't trust men, especially like small business owners that are men that want to hire really young girls to work for them, like as receptionists and things like that, because this is the kind of weird shit they do because they know you have nobody to complain to. And they know that their LLC will protect them from financial ruin. Be wary of that, and be wary of like super old men who will hire you to do work like that, especially like service fields, you know, like babysitting or anywhere where you are seen as like very much beneath, because they will take advantage of that power differential to be fucking creepy. Okay, so let's keep going, but before we do, this is your last chance to leave before I read some really disturbing shit. Consider yourself warned. I said no. I said I'm not confident with my body, Pavlovich recalls. He said it's okay, it's only me, just relax, just have a chat. Very unhinged thing to say to somebody you just met earlier that day. She didn't move. He looked at her again and said, don't ruin the moment. This is what I mean by they will use that leverage against you. He knows that she has more to lose from the situation ultimately than he does. She did as instructed, and he began to stroke her feet. At that point, she recalls she felt a subtle terror. I can only imagine, and I know that 9 out of 10 of us women have probably been in a situation very similar to this. So please be kind to yourself as we go through this. Make sure you're drinking water, calming down your nervous system, all that. Gaiman asked her to sit on his lap. Pavlovich stammered out a few sentences. She was gay. She'd never had sex, and she'd been SA'd by a 45-year-old man when she was 50. Gaiman continued to press. The next part is really amorphous, Pavlovich tells me, but I can tell you that he put his finger straight into my A and tried to put his P in my A. And I said, no, no. Then he tried to rub his privates between my breasts, and I said no as well. Then he asked if he could come on my face. I said no, but he did anyway. He said, call me master and I'll come. He said, be a good girl. You're a good little girl. Sorry, I'm just trying not to throw up. Afterward, Pavlovich crouched down in the water and tried to clean herself off. Gaiman looked at her and smiled. Amanda told me I couldn't have you, Pavlovich recalls him saying. As soon as he had heard this, he knew he had to have her. God, he continued, I wish it were the good old days where we could both fuck you. So this is where Amanda Palmer goes on my shit list. Amanda told me I couldn't have you, so she knows. And if this is not her, like, literally bringing this young woman to Neil as a literal plaything, then I don't know what is. Because if she knew about this kind of behavior and she was still just sending women over there as often as it sounded like she was, then she is absolutely complicit in this. This is giving Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein. In The Sandman, the DC comic book series that ran from 1989 to 1996 and made Gaiman famous, he tells a story about a writer named Richard Maddock. After Maddox's first book proves a success, he sits down to write his second and finds that he can't come up with a single decent idea. This difficulty recedes after he accepts an unusual gift from an older author, a naked woman of a kind, who has been kept locked in a room in his house for 60 years. She is Calliope? I don't know. The youngest of the 9 muses. Maddock rapes her again and again, and his career blossoms in the most extraordinary way. A stylish young beauty tells him how much she loved his characterization of a strong female character, prompting him to remark, "Actually, I do tend to regard myself as a feminist writer." His downfall comes only when the titular hero, the Sandman, also known as the Prince of Stories, frees Calliope from bondage. A being of boundless charisma and creativity, the Sandman rules the dreaming, the realm we visit in our sleep, where stories are spun. Older and more powerful than the most powerful gods, he can reward us with exquisite delights or punish us with unending nightmares, depending on what he feels we deserve. To punish the rapist, the Sandman floods Maddox's mind with such a wild torrent of ideas that he's powerless to write them down, let alone profit from them. Just as a side note, there were people in my comments saying that he stole this entire, like he plagiarized this entire idea of the Sandman story from a Black woman. Somebody said another way he told on himself with Sandman, he literally stole the story from Tanith Lee. The story was apparently called Night's Master. An author who can't write steals material from a woman he has locked up in his home. It's a direct admission of stealing his work from a woman whom he made voiceless and invisible. He's a bone-chilling ghoul. Completely agree. Thank you so much at Live and Let Livia. Love that username. So yeah, read stories by women. That's where men are getting all of their ideas anyway. You might as well go straight to the source. Women have always been the source. And even the worst of men will admit this. Like, even when it comes to the full and harrowing admission of the fact that men will literally fantasize about violently raping and using women in order to get material from the source. You know what I mean? In order to have material. The men are always telling you the truth. Men are incapable of joking, okay? And even with this, punishment is so, like, only a white man could have written this, because he floods his mind with a wild torrent of ideas that he's powerless to write down, let alone profit from them. That's the worst nightmare that this douchebag can fucking imagine, is he has too many good, profitable ideas to write them down, let alone profit from them. No, how about you get raped every single day? How about that's your punishment? No, 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 no. He's just going to be too much of a genius to really, like, put it to paper. Fucking gag me with a spoon. Are you fucking kidding me? As allegations of Gaiman's sexual misconduct emerged this past summer, some observers noticed Gaiman and Maddock have certain things in common. And I tell you, they're always telling on themselves. Like Maddock, Gaiman has called himself a feminist. Check. Like Maddock, Gaiman has racked up major awards. For Gaiman, awards in science fiction and fantasy, as well as dozens of prizes for contemporary novels, short stories, poetry, television, and film, helping make him, according to several sources, a millionaire many times over. Like Maddock, Gaiman has come to be seen as a figure who transcended and transformed the genres in which he wrote. First comics, then fantasy, and children's literature. But for most of his career, readers identified him not with the rapist who shows up in a single issue, but with the Sandman, the inexhaustible fountain of story. That's by design, dear reader. That is very much by design. This past July, a British podcast produced by Tortoise Media broke the news that 2 women had accused Gaiman of SA. Since then, more women have shared allegations of assault, coercion, and abuse. The podcast Master, reported by Paul Caruana Galizia and Rachel Johnson, tells the stories of 5 of them. Gaiman's perspective on these relationships, including with Pavlovich, is that they were entirely consensual. I spoke with 4 of those women along with 4 others whose stories share elements with theirs. I also reviewed contemporaneous diary entries, texts, and emails with friends, messages between Gaiman and the women, and police correspondence. Most of the women were in their 20s when they met Gaiman. The youngest was 18. 2 of them worked for him. 5 were his fans, with one exception, an allegation of forcible kissing from 1986 when Gaiman was in his mid-20s. The stories take place when Gaiman was in his 40s or older, a period in which he lived among the US, the UK, and New Zealand. By then, he had a reputation as an outspoken champion of women. Gaiman insists on telling stories of people who are traditionally marginalized, missing, or silenced in literature, wrote Tara Prescott Johnson in the essay collection Feminism in the Worlds of Neil Gaiman. Although his books abounded with stories of men torturing, raping, and murdering women, this was largely perceived as evidence of his empathy. This is how low the bar is for men. And this is why I say do not trust outspokenly feminist men. The bar for them too is in hell. It's in the same exact place where it is for all the other men, except for the one extra step that they have to take where they say, oh, I'm a feminist. That's it. That's the extent of how far their activism ever has to go. So I actually also covered the initial allegations against Gaiman when they first came out, like when the Tortoise article came out. I'll link those in the video description so y'all can go back. Catherine Kendall was 22 when she met Gaiman in 2012. She was volunteering at one of his events in Asheville, North Carolina. He invited her to join him a few days later at an after party for another event, where he kissed her. The two struck up a flirtatious correspondence, emailing and Skyping in the middle of the night. Kendall did not want to have X with Gaiman, and on one of their calls, she told him this. Afterwards, she recorded his reply in her diary. He had no designs on me beyond flirty friendship, and I believe him thoroughly. She'd grown up listening to his audiobooks, and later told Papillion DeBoer, the host of the podcast Am I Broken? And then that same voice that told me those beautiful stories when I was a kid was telling me the story that I was safe, and that we were just friends, and that he wasn't a threat. At a reading 10 months later, Gaiman suggested that Kendall and 2 other girls wait for him on his tour bus so they could all hang out after he was done signing. When Gaiman showed up, he pulled Kendall into the back of the bus and lay on top of her. And this is exactly how they do these things. If you're surprised, he wouldn't really do that because that's just coming out of nowhere, da-da-da. No, that's exactly how they do it. That's exactly how, because they're hoping that the shock of the situation will sort of help to diffuse your instincts and your ability to defend yourself. He kept saying, kiss me like you mean it, Kendall remembers. She tried to get into it, but she was panicked. Eventually, Gaiman rolled off her. I'm a very wealthy man, she remembers him saying, and I'm used to getting what I want. Years later, Gaiman gave Kendall $60,000 to pay for therapy in an attempt, as he put it, in a recorded phone call to make up some of the damage. So he admits to the damage. In his statement that he put out last night, which would have been January 13th, he was like, no, all of these relationships were consensual. All I see are consensual relationships. And it just proves the point even further that he doesn't understand consent. People are telling you what you did was not consensual, and he's like, all I see is consent. So you don't understand consent fundamentally. It's very interesting. Very much telling on yourself with that. Gaiman had been having actual encounters with younger fans for a long time. Kendra Stout was 18 when in 2003 she drove 4.5 hours to Fort Lauderdale, Florida to see Gaiman read from Endless Nights, a follow-up to The Sandman. She met him in the signing line. Gaiman sent her long emails and bought her a web camera so they could chat on video. If a man is only ever generous to you in ways that benefit him or seem like getting off on it, that man is planning to SA you. 3 years after they met, so he's methodical, he takes his time. He flew to Orlando to take her on a date. He invited her back to his hotel room, put on a playlist of love songs, and held her down with one hand. I'm just going to give another trigger warning because I feel like I have to. Okay. Gaiman didn't believe in foreplay or lubrication, Stout tells me, which could make intercourse particularly painful. When she said it hurt too much, he would tell her the problem was she wasn't submissive enough. He talked at length about the dominant and submissive relationship he wanted out of me. She tells me Stout had no prior interest in BDSM. She says Gaiman never asked what she liked in bed, and there was no discussion of safe words or aftercare or limits. He'd ask her to call him master and beat her with his belt. These were not sexy little taps, she says. When she told him she didn't like it, she says he replied, "It's the only way I can get off." This is why I don't trust men in the BDSM community. Honestly, the BDSM community would not own him either. To be fair, the BDSM community is very big on safe words, aftercare, and limits. What he's doing is not BDSM. What he's doing is assault and abuse. That's what it is. Gaiman told Stout he'd been introduced to these practices by a woman he'd met in his early 20s who had asked him to whip her kitty cat. At the time, he claimed to Stout he was such a naive Englishman that he thought she meant her cat. Then she handed him a flogger and told him to use it on her vagina. "This is what gets me off now," Stout recalls him saying. A similar anecdote shows up in an interview Gaiman gave for a 2022 biography of Kathy Acker, the late experimental punk writer Gaiman befriended in his 20s, but he offers a different account of how it affected him. When Acker asked him to whip her cat, he found it profoundly unschmexual. He told the interviewer, "I did it and ran away." He identified himself as very vanilla. Oh, I understand people's life stories are very complicated and it's hard to really encompass everything, right? Like when I talk about being raised by a single mom and then I talk about my dad in like a following video and people get really confused because they forget two things can be true at once. My parents could have met later on in life. That's how I met my dad. I understand things get confusing, but these are two very different accounts of the same exact situation. Is what a lot of narcissists and abusers and grandstanders will do because they don't ever think that they're going to be caught in these crosshairs. Like, they don't believe this will ever come up for them. They really do sometimes feel so powerful that they'll just start lying in the moment and see if they get away with it. One of Gaiman's greatest gifts as a storyteller was his voice, a warm and gentle instrument that he tuned through elocution lessons as a boy in East Grinstead, 30 miles south of London. In America, people mistakenly assumed he was an English gentleman. He spoke very slowly in a hypnotic way, says one of his former students at the fantasy writing workshop Clarion. He wrote that way too, with rhythm and restraint, lulling you into a trance, in the way that a bard might have done with a lyre. Another gift was his memory. He has libraries full of books memorized. Sure. One of his old friends tells me, noting he could recall the page numbers of his favorite passages and recite them verbatim. His vast collection was eclectic enough to encompass both a box of comics, Spider-Man, Silver Surfer from his boyhood, and the works of Oscar Wilde he received as a gift for his bar mitzvah. For The Sandman, a forgotten DC property he had been hired to dust off and polish up, Gaiman gave the hero a makeover, replacing his green suit, fedora, and gas mask with the leather armor of an angsty goth, and surrounded him with characters drawn from the books he could pull off the shelves in his head, from timeless icons like Shakespeare and Lucifer to the obscure San Francisco eccentric Joshua Abraham Norton. Norman Mailer called it a comic strip of intellectuals. Gaiman and the Sandman shared a penchant for dressing in black, a shock of unruly black hair, and an erotic power seldom possessed by authors of comic books and fantasy novels. There it is. There it is. He just doesn't want to be viewed as the loser that he is. So he has rebranded heroes to look and act like losers. And now he feels cool because he has made that cool. Tale as old as time. A descendant of Polish Jewish immigrants, Gaiman had gotten his start in the 80s as a journalist for hire in London, covering Duran Duran, Lou Reed, and other brooding lords of rock. And in the world of comic conventions, he was the closest thing there was to that archetype. He found and carved for himself out a niche. So he was actually really good at marketing himself. That's really what it is. People that are good at doing this, they usually go pretty far in life. Women would turn up to his signings dressed in the elaborate Victorian goth attire of his characters and beg him to sign their breasts or slip him key cards to their hotel rooms. One writer recounts running into Gaiman at a World Fantasy Convention in 2011. His assistant wasn't around and he was late to a reading. "I can't get to it if I walk by myself," he told her. As they made their way through the convention side by side, the whole floor full of people tilted and slid toward him, she says. They wanted to be entwined with him in ways I was not prepared to defend him against. A woman fell to her knees and wept. Now, mind you, this may seem extreme, but yes, like, stuff like this is real. A lot of women do this to their heroes in general. Like, if you tell me that women are not acting like this at a Taylor Swift concert, like, this is not special. Except for Taylor Swift is hopefully not sleeping with or abusing any of her fans that are half her age, that she's old enough to be their mother. Women are really good at gaslighting themselves into believing that they really know somebody based on how they present themselves, which is why so many of these predators have a very carefully curated persona, just like Neil did. He aligned himself with the Sandman, this like all-powerful, older than the gods, wise creature, who he rebranded himself as. So, of course, women felt safe doing that kind of stuff around him because they were like, surely he's not the villain in the story. Surely he's the hero. This next part is also extremely important. People who flock to fantasy conventions and signings make up an inherently vulnerable community. One of Gaiman's former friends, a fantasy writer, tells me. They wrap themselves around a beloved text so it becomes their self-identity, she says. They want to share their souls with the creators of these works. And if you have morality around it, you say no. It was an open secret in the late 90s and early aughts among convention goers that Gaiman cheated on his first wife, Mary McGrath, a private Midwestern Scientologist he'd married in his early 20s. But in my conversations with Gaiman's old friends, collaborators, and peers, nearly all of them told me that they never imagined that Gaiman's affairs could have been anything but enthusiastically consensual. As one prominent editor in the field puts it, the one thing I hear again and again, largely from women, is he was always nice to me, he was always a gentleman. The writer Kelly Link, who met Gaiman at a reading in 1997, recalls finding him charmingly goofy. He was hapless in a way that was kind of exasperating, she says, but also made him seem very harmless. Someone who had a sexual relationship with Gaiman in the aughts recalls him flipping through questions fans wrote on cards at a Q&A session. Once a fan asked if she could be his ex-slave. He read it aloud and said, well, no. He'd be very demure. This is the part that y'all need to really understand, is that abusers and predators are willing to put in a lot of work to make sure that they don't seem or come off as one. Because the stuff that they want to do to you behind closed doors, they need to make sure that nobody would ever believe you. And this is why they put so much work into their public image, their persona, their PR, their rebrand. When you come across people like that, be wary. When it comes to being a multi-millionaire and a best-selling author and just a successful person in general, there's always going to be people, especially other men, that are going to protect these male predators and say, oh, no, those girls all wanted it. It couldn't have been anything other than consensual. And the thing that these men do not understand, or is not willing to think about it long enough to understand, is that these predators rarely pick the women who enthusiastically want them, because that's not what they get off on. They get off, like Neil Gaiman, on being called master and on pressing and forcing somebody into doing things that they don't want to do. That's why he specifically picked on people that were like his employees, like very vastly inappropriate power dynamics, because that's what he gets off on. He doesn't get off on consensual relationships. There will be men and women who will say, oh, no, he was so nice, he was so goofy, he was whatever. It's because he doesn't have the physical ability, right, to grape and assault everybody he comes into contact with. Some people he's going to be nice to. I don't know why that's so fucking hard for people, and especially men, to understand. A lot of people are villains behind closed doors, because if they were villains in real life, people wouldn't work with them. And they're also very nice to anybody that could get them further on in life. So other powerful men, absolutely, their peers will have nothing but good things to say about them. Women who are his peers will have nothing bad to say about him, because they know damn well what they're doing, and because they are very calculating. It's not that they can't control themselves. It's that They want to control other people. That's what they get off on. They don't get off on consent and enthusiasm, unfortunately. All right, another trigger warning. In 2007, mind you, I'm only 30% of the way done with this article. In 2007, Gaiman and Stout took a trip to the Cornish countryside. On their last night there, Stout developed a UTI that had gotten so bad she couldn't sit down. She told Gaiman they could fool around, but that any penetration would be too painful to bear. It was a big hard no, she says. I told him, you cannot put anything in my V or I will die. Gaiman flipped her over on the bed, she says, and attempted to penetrate her with his fingers. She told him no. He stopped for a moment and then he penetrated her with his member. At that point, she tells me, I just shut down. She lay on the bed until he was finished. This past October, she filed a police report alleging he raped her. According to the podcast, which quoted Gaiman through his representatives, his position was that sexual degradation, bondage, domination, sadism, and masochism may not be to everyone's taste, but between consenting adults, BDSM is lawful. Gaiman declined to speak with me despite multiple requests, but through a legal representative, he responded to some claims. If you know nothing about BDSM, Gaiman's claim that he was engaging in it with these women may sound plausible, at least in some cases. The kind of domineering violence he inflicted on them is common among people who practice BDSM, and all of the women at some point played along, calling him their master, texting him afterward that they needed him, even writing that they loved and missed him. But there's a crucial difference between BDSM and what Gaiman was doing. An acronym for bondage, discipline, dominance, and submission, and sadism and masochism. BDSM is a culture with a set of long-standing norms, the most important of which is that all parties must eagerly and clearly consent to the overall dynamic, as well as to each act before they engage in it. This, as many practitioners, including ex-educators like Dossie Easton and Janet W. Hardy, who wrote some of the defining texts of the subculture, women, mind you, have stressed over decades that this is the defining line that separates BDSM from abuse. Because you do have to have a way to separate them. Otherwise, BDSM and kink and fetish is just going to be used as a way to justify abuse, which I'm sure none of the members in those respective communities would ever want. It was a line that Gaiman, according to the women, did not respect. Two of the women who have never spoken to each other compared him to an anglerfish, the deep-sea predator that uses a bulb of bioluminescence to lure prey into its jaws. Instead of a light, one says, he would dangle a floppy-haired, soft-spoken British guy. After Gaiman got into the bathtub with Pavlovich, she retreated to Palmer's house, which was vacant at the time. She sat in the shower for an hour crying, then got into Palmer's bed and began to search the internet for clues that might explain what had happened to her. She Googled Me Too and Neil Gaiman, nothing. The only negative stories she found were about how he'd broken COVID lockdown rules in 2020 and had been forced to apologize to the people of the Isle of Skye for endangering their lives. At the end of the weekend, Palmer texted Pavlovich to say how pleased she was to see Pavlovich and her child get along. The universe is a karmic mystery, Palmer wrote. We nourish each other in the most random and unpredictable ways. Palmer asked if she could babysit again. She needed so much help. Would Pavlovich consider staying with them for the foreseeable future? Pavlovich was living in a sublet that was about to end. She was broke and hadn't been able to find a new apartment. She'd been homeless at the start of the pandemic when the perfumery closed and had ended up crashing on the beach in a friend's sleeping bag on and off for 2 weeks of lockdown. The thought of returning to the beach filled her with dread. She didn't consider reaching out to her own family. Her parents had divorced when she was 3, and Pavlovich had grown up splitting time between their household. Violence, Pavlovich tells me, was normalized in the household. One close family member beat her with a belt. Another would strangle Pavlovich when she got upset and slap her across the face until her cheeks were raw. She began to regularly cut her arms and wrists with a knife when she was 11. She became bulimic, then anorexic. By 13, Pavlovich had grown so thin that she ended up in a psychiatric unit at Auckland Children's Hospital and spent weeks on a feeding tube. When she was 15, she left home and never went back. In the years since, she had been looking for a new family, but many of the people she'd encountered in that search turned out to be abusive as well. After all of this, Amanda Palmer was an actual creature sent from a celestial realm. It was like hallelujah, Pavlovich tells me. Palmer was famous for speaking out against sexual abuse and encouraging others to do the same. In songs and essays she had written of having been essayed and raped on multiple occasions as a teenager and young woman. Pavlovich didn't think that someone like that could be married to someone who would assault women, which that's actually extremely common. And this is once again why these rich, powerful predators go after vulnerable people who have nothing but misery to look back on. And they offer them material type safeties in order to extract much, much, much more from them in labor and trauma and all of these things. SA is one of the most confusing forms of violence that a person can experience. The majority of people who have endured it do not immediately recognize it as such. Some never do. You're not thinking in a linear or logical fashion, Pavlovich says, but the mind is trying to process it in the ways that it can. Whatever had happened in the bath, she'd been through worse and survived, she thought. And Gaiman and Palmer were offering her the possibility of a shared future. Palmer's vision of herself as the central figure of a utopian community could, according to some of her friends, make her careless with the young, impressionable women she invited into her and her husband's lives. Her idealism, quote unquote, could blind her to reality, one friend says. Palmer declined to be interviewed, but I spoke with people close to her. Palmer told Pavlovich they might travel to London together and to Scotland, where Gaiman was shooting the second season of Good Omens. Pavlovich had wanted to leave New Zealand, her epicenter of trauma, for as long as she could remember. These conversations filled her head with fantasies of finally being on solid ground in the world. After Palmer's offer, Pavlovich texted Gaiman, "I'm consumed by thoughts of you, the things you will do to me. I'm so hungry. What a terrible creature you've turned me into." The following weekend, she'd packed up her sublet and boarded the ferry to Waiheke. Throughout his career, Gaiman has written about terror from the point of view as a child. His most recent novel, The Ocean at the End of the Lane, tells the story of a quiet and bookish 7-year-old boy. Through various unfortunate events, he ends up with a hole in his heart that can never be healed, a doorway through which nightmares from distant realms enter our world. Over the course of the tale, the boy suffers terribly, sometimes at the hands of his own family. At dinner one night, the boy refuses to eat the food his nanny has prepared. The nanny, the boy knows, isn't really a human, but a nightmare creature from another world. When his father demands to know why he won't eat, the boy explains, "She's a monster." His father becomes enraged. To punish him, he fills the tub, then picks up the child, plunges him into the bath, and pushes his shoulders and head beneath the chilly water. "I had read many books in that bath," the boy says. "It was one of my safe places. And now I had no doubt I was going to die there." Later that night, the boy runs away from home. On his way out, he glimpses his father having intercourse with the monstrous nanny through the drawing room window. In various interviews over the years, Gaiman has called The Ocean at the End of the Lane his most personal book. While much of it is fantastical, Gaiman has said, "That kid is me." The book is set in Sussex, where Gaiman grew up. In the story, the narrator survives otherworldly evil with the help of a family of magical women. As a child, Gaiman had no such friends to call on. "I was going back to the 7-year-old me and giving myself a peculiar kind of love that I didn't have." A mother wound. That's what that's called, a mother wound. And bitterness and misogyny towards women because of that. You're mad at the mother that didn't protect you from the father that clearly abused you and cheated on her and did all of these things. "I never feel the past is dead or young Neil isn't around anymore. He's still there hiding in a library somewhere, looking for a doorway that will lead him to somewhere safe where everything works." While Gaiman has identified the boy in the book as himself, he has also claimed that none of the things that happened to the boy happened to him. Yet there is reason to believe that some of the most horrifying events of the novel did occur. Okay, so here's where we get into a very interesting part of this article to me. This is why I think this was such incredible investigative journalism, because to uncover and to connect these parts of Neil Gaiman's childhood, in my mind, this is what solidifies a lot of the claims that these women made about him, because the abuse that he perpetrated onto them directly parallels his own childhood trauma. And as we know, when trauma is not dealt with, it escapes regardless. This is why individuals are highly encouraged to deal with their trauma before they take it out on others. I also believe, obviously, that trauma does not have to cause you to do bad things. It can take you to some dark places, but it doesn't have to cause you to do bad things. I think we're seeing an intersection of trauma, power, misogyny, all of those types of things coming together to create this perfect storm. So while Gaiman has identified the boy in the book as himself, he has also claimed that none of the things that happened to the boy happened to him. Yet there is reason to believe that some of the most horrifying events of the novel did occur. Gaiman has rarely spoken about a core fact of his childhood. In 1965, when Neil was 5 years old, his parents, David and Sheila, left their jobs as a business executive and a pharmacist and bought a house in East Grinstead, a mile away from what was at the time the worldwide headquarters for the Church of Scientology. Its founder, the former science fiction writer L. Ron Hubbard, lived down the road from them from 1965 to 1967, when he fled the country and began directing the church from international waters, pursued by the CIA, FBI, and a handful of foreign governments and maritime agencies. David and Sheila were among England's earliest adherents to Scientology. They began studying Dianetics in 1956 and eventually took positions in the Guardian's Office, a special department of the organization dedicated to handling the church's growing number of legal cases, public communications, and intelligence operations. The mission of this office, as Hubbard wrote, was its covert use in destroying the repute of individuals and groups. So you see how this is all kind of built in. This is all built into his childhood and upbringing. Bookmark it, okay? On the side, the Gaimans ran the church's canteen, lodged foreign Scientologists in their home, and opened a vitamin company in town, where they supplied courses of supplements for Scientology's detoxification programs, a business that grew exponentially alongside the expansion of the church. By the late 60s, David was the church's public face and chief spokesperson in the UK. Mind you, this is Neil Gaiman's father. It was a challenging job, to say the least. The UK, following the example of a handful of other governments, had issued a report declaring Scientology's methods a serious danger to the health of those who submit to them because it's a cult. Hubbard would routinely punish members of the organization who committed minor infractions by binding them, blindfolding them, and throwing them overboard into icy waters. Bookmark it. Back in England, David gave interviews to the press to smooth over such troubling accounts. The church was under particular pressure to assure the public it was not harming children. In his bulletins to members, Hubbard had made it clear that children were not to be exempt from the punishments to which adults were subjected. If a child laughed inappropriately or failed to remember a Scientology term, they could be sent to the ship's hold and made to chip rust for days, or confined in a chain locker for weeks at a time without blankets or a bathroom. In his book, Going Clear, Lawrence Wright recounts the story of a 4-year-old boy named Derek Green, an adopted black child who stole a Rolex and dropped it overboard. He was confined to the locker for 2 days and nights. When his mother pleaded with Hubbard to let him out, he reminded her of the Scientology axiom that children are actually adults in small bodies and equally responsible for their behavior. A representative for the Church of Scientology said it does not speak about members past or present, but denies that this event occurred. David used Neil as an exhibit in his case to the public. In 1968, he arranged for Neil to give an interview to the BBC. When the reporter asked the child if Scientology made him a better boy, Neil replied, "Not exactly that, but when you make a release, you feel absolutely great." A release in Scientology lingo is what happens when you complete one of the lower levels of coursework. What was happening away from the cameras is difficult to know, in part because Gaiman has avoided talking about it, changing the subject whenever an interviewer or a friend brings it up. But it seems unlikely that he would have been spared the disciplinary measures inflicted on adults and children as a standard practice at that time. According to someone who knew the Gaimans, David and Sheila did apply Scientology's methods at home. When Neil was around the age of the child in the ocean at the end of the lane, the person said David took him up to the bathtub, ran a cold bath, and drowned him to the point where Neil was screaming for air. As a teenager, Neil worked for the Church of Scientology for 3 years as an auditor and minister of the church who conducts a process some have likened to hypnosis. One former member of the church who worked with Gaiman's parents and was audited by Gaiman recalls him as a precocious and ambitious. It was unusual for a teenager to have completed such a high level of training, he tells me. But the Gaimans were like royalty, he says. In 1981, David was promoted to lead the Guardian's office, making him one of the most powerful people in the church. But the same year, he fell from grace. A new generation of Scientologists, led by David Miscavige, who eventually succeeded Hubbard as the church's leader, had Hubbard's ear. And David was caught in that grinder, as his former colleague puts it. A document declaring David a suppressive person was released a few years later. It accused him of a range of offenses, including sexual misconduct. David, as the document claims, put on a front of being mild-mannered and quite sociable, adding that his actions belie this. His greatest offense, it seemed, was hubris. Gaiman required others to look up to him instead of to source, it reads, referring to Hubbard. So this is just like a bunch of toxic men using each other to hype each other up. But what happens in these environments naturally is that the men also turn on each other because it's ultimately a power struggle. So if you refuse to like kiss the ring, you're going to get ousted for the horrible things that you could have kept doing behind closed doors had you never challenged the authority. But this is the only time that men will tell on each other. They'll prosecute each other for SA or anything like that, is when they're looking to take another man down or when another man is threatening the power that they have built for themselves. I love the parallels that this author is bringing up between how both Neil Gaiman and his dad hid behind this, mild-mannered, charming British guy act. I think that's a very important parallel because I think Gaiman, we're about to get into some real dark shit, and I think that Gaiman is just reliving his trauma that his dad inflicted on him. Not that that excuses any of what he does, but I literally think that he is following in his father's footsteps, like quite literally. This is what men do. Like, they're not original. They make it other people's problem. In the 80s, David was sent off to a sort of rehabilitation camp. It was around this time that Gaiman set out to make a living as a writer. Charming and strategic, he used the contacts he developed as a journalist to break into the business of genre writing, endearing himself to the giants of that world at the time. Douglas Adams, Arthur C. Clarke, Clive Barker, Terry Pratchett, Alan Moore. When I was young, I had unbelievable chutzpah, Gaiman says in the documentary Neil Gaiman Dreamed Dangerously. Ooh. The kind of monstrous self-certainty that you only get normally in people who then go on to conquer half the civilized world. I addressed the statement in my other video. I think it's disgusting that he said that. Clearly shows his delusions of grandeur. Gaiman and Palmer met in 2008 when she was 32 and he was 47. Both were at a turning point in their lives and careers. Gaiman was in the midst of finalizing a divorce from his first wife, probably who was his own age, with whom he had 3 children, and on the verge of breaking into Hollywood. 9 of his works have been turned into movies or TV shows. Palmer was in a fight with her record label that would culminate in a split. Palmer had a collection of photos of herself posing as a murdered corpse and wanted Gaiman to write captions to go along with the pictures. Gaiman liked the idea, of course, and the two met to work on the project, a book tied to her first solo album, Who Killed Amanda Palmer. As Palmer described in The Art of Asking, they were not attracted to each other at first. I thought he looked like a baggy-eyed, grumpy old man, and he thought I looked like a chubby little boy. Gaiman was the first to propose a romantic relationship. In an interview, he later said, I got together with her because I couldn't ever imagine being bored. Just know that this is how men view you. They'll be like, oh, she's ugly, she looks like a fat little boy, but you know what, I can't really imagine being bored with her, and I'm kind of bored right now. Exactly. Women are always the source that men go to in order to draw inspiration and a will to live. So when men ask you, what do you bring to the table? You should always just laugh in their face. Because it's them that needs you, not the other way around. Palmer she could imagine being bored. Ever since she'd gotten her start as a street busker and painting her face white and standing on a crate in Harvard Square dressed as a silent 8-foot-tall bride, she prided herself on a low-rent bohemian lifestyle. Couch surfing when she toured, playing random shows in the living room of her fans. She had no savings and didn't own a car, real estate, or kitchen appliances. Gaiman owned multiple houses. He was too rich, too famous, too British, too awkward, too old. And they didn't have great sexual chemistry. But he appeared to be kind and stable, a family man, and they shared a dark, fantastical aesthetic. She also felt a little sorry for him. Never do this. He seemed lonely in spite of his fame, and Palmer found herself hoping that she could help him never do this. He'd believed for a long time deep down that people didn't actually fall in love, she wrote in her book. But that's impossible, she told him. He'd written stories and scenes of people in love. That's the whole point, darling, he said. Writers make things up. Men will tell you the truth. You just have to ask. He's not in love with her. He never loved her. He married her for convenience and as entertainment. Meanwhile, she's the one feeling sorry for him. Like, no, girl, feel sorry for yourself. They wed in 2011 in the Berkeley home of their friends Michael Chabon and Ayelet Waldman, the novelists. Their union had a multiplying effect on their fame and stature, drawing each other out of their respective domains of cult stardom and into the airy realm of tech-funded virality. They became darlings of the TED Talk circuit and regulars at Jeff Bezos' ultra-secret campfire retreat. Clearly, it's not that fucking secret. Gaiman introduced Palmer to Twitter, which he had used to become Fantasy's most beloved author of 140-character Bonds mods. Palmer, in turn, leaned into her growing reputation as a crowdfunding genius. Online, they flirted, went after each other's critics, and praised each other's progressive politics. So they were basically sucking each other's dick online. In an interview with Out magazine in 2012, Palmer said that the main other relationship in both of their lives was with their fans. Sometimes when I'm with Neil and go to the other room to Twitter with my followers, it feels like sneaking off for a quick shag. This wasn't strictly a metaphor. During the early years of their marriage, they lived apart for months at a time and encouraged each other to have affairs. According to conversations with 5 of Palmer's closest friends, the most important rule governing their open relationship was honesty. They found that sharing the details of their extramarital dalliances and sometimes sharing the same partners brought them closer together. Do you see why people don't trust, like, the couple that saw you from across the bar? Like, this is why people don't trust people in open and polyamorous relationships, because it is ultimately like a selfish and sick and twisted thing for a lot of people. I'm not saying for everybody, but for a lot of people, they're like, oh, it brings us closer together. Okay, what about the other person? Are they just a piece of meat that you both came on or whatever? Like, what the fuck is wrong with you? Why would you talk about other people like that? It's giving like you're not viewing them as a human being, but as a sex object. Like, that's not okay. 2012, Palmer met a 20-year-old fan who was asked to be referred to as Rachel at a Dresden Dolls concert. After one of Palmer's next shows, the women had sex. The morning after, Palmer snapped a few semi-naked pictures of Rachel and asked if she could send one to Gaiman. She and Palmer slept together a few more times, but then Palmer seemed to lose interest in intercourse with her. Some 6 months after they met, Palmer introduced Rachel to Gaiman online, telling Rachel, oh, he'll love you. The two struck up a correspondence that quickly turned sexual, and Gaiman invited her to his house in Wisconsin. As she packed for the trip, she asked Palmer over email if she had any advice for pleasing Gaiman in bed. Palmer joked in response, I think the fun is finding out on your own. With Gaiman, Rachel says there was never a blatant rupture of consent, but that he was always pressing her to do things that hurt and scared her. Looking back, she feels Palmer gave her to him like a toy. So I'm just going to press on that statement a little bit and say that it is a blatant rupture of consent to press somebody to do things that hurt and scare them. It is a pretty blatant rupture of consent. When you're being cajoled or manipulated into doing these things, that's a blatant rupture of consent. No is a complete sentence. No, I don't want to do that. No, I'm not interested in that. No, that doesn't float my boat. That's a complete sentence. And anybody who keeps sort of being like, no, but I think you're going to really like it and pressures you into doing it, that is a bad person. That's not somebody who wants your best interests at heart. They're only in it for themselves. Yes, you are just a toy to them. For Gaiman and Palmer, these were happy years because they're both narcissists, I promise you. With his editing help, she wrote The Art of Asking. They toured together, and when Palmer was offered a residency at Bard College, Gaiman tagged along to give some talks. They ended up receiving an offer to join the faculty as a professor of the arts. After they'd been together for a few years, Palmer began asking Gaiman to tell her more about his childhood in Scientology, but he seemed unable to string more than a few sentences together. When she encouraged him to continue, he would curl up on the bed into a fetal position and cry. He refused to see a therapist. Instead, he sat down to write a short story that kept getting longer until it had turned into a novel. Although the child at the center of the story in many ways remains opaque, Palmer felt he had never been so open. He dedicated the book The Ocean at the End of the Lane to Amanda, who wanted to know. In 2014, the cracks in Gaiman and Palmer's marriage began to show to those around them. While they were at Bard, they decided to buy a house upstate. Palmer would have preferred to live in New York City, but Gaiman liked the woods, of course, because he's a fucking troll. Eventually, he picked a sprawling estate set on 80 acres in Woodstock. It was Gaiman's money, a friend who accompanied them on the house hunt says, and he was going to have the say. So he definitely has a domination kink, even though he's already successful, powerful, and rich. He still feels the need to use those things in order to feel powerful. That tells you that he's incredibly insecure, and an incredibly insecure man is also incredibly dangerous. Later that year, Palmer got pregnant. She and Gaiman were spending more time at home together and talked about slowing down and devoting their attention to their marriage. She wanted to close the relationship, and he agreed. But when she was 8 months pregnant, Gaiman came to her with a problem. He had slept with a fan in her early 20s, taking her virginity. Now Gaiman told her the girl was going crazy. He promised to change, and they met with a couples counselor. Gaiman was prone to panic attacks and had never been in treatment. Amanda was shocked at how traumatized Neil was, given his public persona and the guy she thought she'd married, a person close to them says. It's a real shame because a lot of men will hide this from you as best as they can, literally until times like this, until times that they isolate you out in the woods, buy a house, and get you pregnant. And then they'll do the most diabolical, twisted thing to you, and because they know that you have no choice now but to stay and like work things out with them. Or they think that you have no choice now but to stay and work things out with them. One of the people in whom Palmer confided about her marital issues at the time was Caroline, a potter who, along with her builder husband Philip, had been living on the Woodstock property and working as a caretaker. Gaiman had made them an offer that seemed too good to be true. They would build an addition on one of the cabins on the land at Gaiman's expense, and in exchange, Gaiman would sell them a 5-acre parcel, allowing them to put up a barn-style home to share with their 3 daughters. They tended to the garden, ran errands for guests, and rehabilitated the buildings, which needed plumbing and electrical work. That's a lot of work, by the way. He was like still ripping them off. They should have really done the math on all that. Don't ever think that these rich people have your best interests at heart. They're typically not as rich as they let on. Like, they're not as liquid as they may seem. And a lot of times they don't actually have the money or desire or any kind of future plans to pay you for the work that you do. At lunch one day, Palmer told Caroline she hated living in the woods and was disturbed by what she was learning about her husband. You have no idea the twisted, dark things that go on in that man's head. If there's anything like other than what the shit he wrote in his books, if it's more dark and twisted than that, I can't imagine. Like, she's right. I can't imagine. Palmer said she wished her marriage were more like Caroline and Philip's, but their marriage of 11 years was falling apart too. In 2017, Philip moved out of their house. Caroline, 54 at the time, spent her years in bed crying and drinking. She stopped eating and for the most part stopped working. It was then that Gaiman began paying attention to her. Like, he smelled blood in the water and was like, oh, perfect. He would bring juices up to her cabin and fret that she was losing too much weight. The first time he touched her in December 2018, she was sitting on his couch next to him crying from exhaustion. Gaiman told her, "You need a hug." She stood and he hugged her, then slid his hands down her pants and into her underwear and squeezed her butt. She does not recall saying or doing anything in response. "I was stunned," she says. Again, that's what they're counting on. They're counting that their actions will shock you into silence because he's doing it so matter-of-factly, right? And when men do that, always know that they've just done something inappropriate. Like, never question the propriety of it. It's inappropriate. Just because they did it confidently does not mean you gave them any kind of signal to do that. Over the next 2 years, they had a series of sexual encounters, always when Palmer was away. When Gaiman wasn't around, they occasionally engaged in phone intercourse. At first, Caroline, who hadn't been with anyone since Philip left, went along willingly. But at the end of their second encounter, she remembers asking Gaiman what Palmer would think about their romance. He said, "Caroline, there is no romance." After that, she tried to keep her distance from him, darting away when she saw him on the estate. He was difficult to avoid. He kept an egg incubator in Caroline's cabin and would come down and check on it, entering without texting first. On one of these visits, he found her crying by the fireplace. He walked over to her, stuck his thumb in her mouth, and twisted her nipples. She told Gaiman the arrangement was making her feel bad. She recalls him replying, "I don't want you to feel bad." But nothing changed. So he meant what he said. He just meant, "I don't want you to feel bad. Like, I want to keep doing what I'm doing, but I don't want you to feel bad or tell me about that." Caroline had no income at the time and was borrowing money from her sister to get by. She worried that if she didn't appease Gaiman, he'd kick her out of her house, and then she and her 3 daughters would have nowhere to go. Mind you, he's doing all this with her 3 daughters in the house. "I like our trade," she remembers him saying. "You take care of me, and I'll take care of you." Sometimes she would babysit. Once Caroline and the boy, then 4, fell asleep reading stories in Gaiman and Palmer's bed. Okay, brace yourself, please. Caroline woke up when Gaiman returned home. He got into bed with the sun in the middle, then reached across the child to grab Caroline's hand and put it on his penis. She says she jumped out of bed. He didn't have boundaries, Caroline says. I remember thinking that there was something really wrong with him. Like, yeah, obviously. This to me is screaming the reenactment of childhood trauma. And again, does not excuse it in any way, but I think this was same type of shit that his dad would do to him. In April 2021, Gaiman informed Caroline that the land he'd promised her was no longer available. Exactly. That summer, she stopped responding to his attempts to engage in phone sex, and Gaiman increased the pressure on her to leave his property. One night in December 2021, Gaiman's business manager, Terry Bird, called Caroline and offered her $5,000 to move immediately if she'd sign a 16-page NDA, agreeing to never discuss anything about her experience with Gaiman or Palmer or to take legal action against Gaiman. Caroline recalls saying to Bird, "What am I going to do with $5,000? I need therapy. This is maybe $300,000. Looking back, she says she didn't know how she came up with that number, but Gaiman agreed to it and she signed. Gaiman's representatives say Caroline initiated the encounters and denied that he engaged in any activity with her in the presence of his son. So 2 months later, Pavlovich arrived on Waiheke. So clock that. 2 months later. So they're basically using women as nanny bangmates, the two of these sick, twisted individuals. I think Amanda just got really sick and tired of like dealing with his dark side, that she was like, okay, just to like pacify you, I'm just gonna keep sacrificing women at the altar of your depravity. And I think that's really sick. By then, Palmer and Gaiman were divorcing. According to Palmer's friends, she asked for a divorce after Rachel called to tell her that she and Gaiman were still having sexual contact, long past the point when Palmer thought their relationship had ended. She was hurt but unsurprised. "I find it all very boring," she wrote to Rachel, who recalls the exchange. Just the lack of self-knowledge and the lack of interest in self-knowledge. In late 2021, Palmer found out about Caroline too. "I remember her saying, 'That poor woman,'" recalls Lance Horn, a musician and friend of Palmer's in whom she confided at the time. "I can't believe he did it again." So again, she was very privy to his dark little secrets that he was doing to these women, and she did nothing to stop him. By the time she had asked Pavlovich to babysit, Palmer was fed up with Gaiman's behavior, but she still had some faith in his decency, a friend says. Still, she knew enough to warn Gaiman to stay away from their new babysitter. "I remember specifically her saying, 'You could really hurt this person and break her. Keep your hands off of her,'" the friend says. And Palmer still hoped, according to those close to her, that she and Gaiman would be able to negotiate a peaceful co-parenting arrangement. She found a school for their child and the 2 houses on Waiheke. She was going to do her best to keep Neil as a presence for her son, one friend says. And this is once again why these men will get you pregnant. I think his trapping of Amanda Palmer was also very methodical, right? He found this woman who is like very strong, very independent. She's been able to build up, something for herself, right? He had all these fans throwing themselves at him and stuff like that, but they couldn't help him. They couldn't help him build his career, and he saw something in her. And then he primed her for like a shitty, loveless relationship by saying that, "Oh, I just thought you looked like a chubby boy when I met you. I didn't even think you were hot. Oh, I don't really believe in love. Like, I don't believe people fall in love." He primed her to live in this loveless sort of quid pro quo arrangement where she still gave more of herself than he ended up ever giving. Then he got her pregnant. And now he knows that in order to protect their child, she is going to have to do what he wants, have to protect him from all that sort of crap coming out so that their child is not affected by how disgusting their father is. I think he observed this dynamic between his own mother and father. The fact that his dad was so domineering and abusive and stuff like that, and you almost never hear anything about his mom. Like, in fact, in that book, The Ocean at the End of the Lane, he has like this group of magical women that help him and says, "I had no such presence in my life." Clock that. That's the mother wound. He hates his mom for not protecting him. He hates his mom for, standing maybe beside his dad or ignoring the shit that he was doing. But he also longs to recreate that same dynamic because he is stuck on the trauma. At the end of the day, he doesn't want to be a better person. That's why he's doing all this instead of becoming a better person. One evening, Palmer dropped Pavlovich and the child off with Gaiman and retreated back to her own place. Pavlovich was in the kitchen tidying up when he approached her from behind and pulled her to the sofa. "It all happened again so quickly," Pavlovich says. Gaiman pushed down her pants and began to beat her with his belt. Trigger warning, obviously. He then attempted to initiate anal sex without lubrication. "I screamed no," Pavlovich says. Had Gaiman and Pavlovich been engaging in BDSM, this could conceivably have been part of a grape scene, a scenario sometimes described as consensual non-consent. But that would have required careful negotiation in advance, which she says they had not done. After she said no, Gaiman backed off briefly and went into the kitchen. When he returned, he brought butter to use as lubricant. She continued to scream until Gaiman was finished. Oh my God. Ugh. When it was over, he called her slave and ordered her to clean him up. She protested that it wasn't hygienic. He said, "Are you defying your master?" She recalls. "I had to lick my own shit." So, y'all, it's about to get worse. If that was hard for you to handle, if you did not like that, if that made your body feel unsafe, take a minute, take some time. Maybe don't finish the video. I don't know. Take care of yourself. This is not easy to read. It wasn't easy to read the first time. It's more difficult reading it out loud. The reason I'm doing this is because it's important to call these abusers out, and it's important for people to have all the information. Afterwards, she got into the shower and tried to wash her mouth out with a bar of lavender soap. It had a grainy texture and tasted of metal, acid, and herbs. She noticed blood swirling down the drain. He hadn't used a condom, and she worried she might have gotten an infection. She had a migraine, and her whole body ached. But she didn't consider leaving. She'd hated herself her whole life, she tells me. And when someone comes along and hates you as much as yourself, it is kind of a relief, without it always being consent. She says she understands how Scientologists might have felt when they were sent to the hole, a detention center where they were forced to lick the floor as punishment. She'd heard of how some would stay in the room even after they were allowed to leave. People keep licking the floor in that horrible room, she says. It involves breaking down your spirit and your will to literally live. And your idea of yourself as a sovereign individual that deserves to be treated with basic respect and kindness. The nights with Gaiman blurred together. There was the time she passed out from pain while Gaiman was having anal intercourse with her. He made her perform oral while his member had urine on it. He ordered her to suck him off while he watched screeners for the first season of The Sandman. In one instance, he thrust his member into Pavlovich's mouth with such force that she vomited on him. Then he told her to eat the vomit off his lap and lick it up from the couch. A week or so into Pavlovich's time with the family, their son began to address her as slave and ordered Pavlovich to call him master. Gaiman seemed to find it amusing. Sometimes he'd say to his child in an affable tone, Now, Scarlett's not a slave. No, you mustn't." One day, Pavlovich came into the living room when Gaiman and the boy were on the couch watching the children's show Odd Squad. She joined them sitting down next to the child. Gaiman put his arm around them both, reached into Pavlovich's shirt, and fondled her breasts. She says he didn't make any effort to hide what he was doing from the boy. Another time during the day, he requested oral in the middle of the kitchen, while the boy was awake and somewhere in the house. He would never shut a door, she says. I'm just going to give another trigger warning before we go on to the next part. If you are sensitive to instances of CSA, don't listen to the next part. On February 19th, 2022, Gaiman and his son spent the night at a hotel in Auckland, which they sometimes did for fun. Gaiman asked Pavlovich if she could come by and watch the child for an hour so he could get a massage. It was a small room, one double bed, a television, and a bathroom. When he returned, Gaiman and the boy ate dinner, takeout from a nearby deli. Afterward, Gaiman wanted to watch a movie, but the child wanted to play with the iPad. The boy sat against the wall by the picture window overlooking the city, facing the bed. Pavlovich perched on the edge of the mattress. Gaiman got onto the bed and pulled her so she was on her back. He lifted the covers up over them. She tried to signal to him with her eyes that he should stop. She mouthed, "What the fuck are you doing?" She didn't want the child to overhear what she was saying. Gaiman ignored her. He rolled her onto her side, took off his pants, pulled off her skirt, and began to have intercourse with her from behind while continuing to speak with his son. "You should really get off the iPad," she recalls him saying. Pavlovich, in a state of shock, buried her head in the pillow. After about 5 minutes, Gaiman got up and walked to the bathroom half naked. He urinated on his hand and then returned to Pavlovich, frozen on the bed, and told her to lick it off. He went back to the bathroom, naked from the waist down. "Before you leave," he told Pavlovich, "you have to finish your job." She went to the bathroom and he pushed her to her knees. The door was open. Gaiman's representatives say these allegations are false, not to mention deplorable. 3 weeks after Pavlovich arrived on Waiheke, Palmer told her that the child would be traveling with Gaiman to Edinburgh in a few days to visit the Amazon production of his series, Anansi Boys. They wouldn't need her for a couple of weeks. So all of those fairy tales that they spun to her about traveling with them and going on set, that was all false. That morning, Pavlovich came down with COVID. Palmer and Gaiman agreed that she could isolate in Gaiman's empty home. They still hadn't paid her for a single hour she'd worked for them. The pictures of her in their home look heartbreaking. 10 days after Gaiman left New Zealand, Pavlovich went to Palmer's house for dinner. She asked Palmer if she could tell her something in confidence and made her promise not to tell Gaiman. She begged for reassurance that she would still keep her job as the child's nanny. Palmer assured Pavlovich her employment was not in danger. Sitting in the kitchen, Pavlovich told Palmer that Gaiman had made a pass at her. She told Palmer about the bath. I didn't have any choice in the matter, she said. He just did it. She said he had been having intercourse with her ever since. She withheld some of the most brutal details and did not describe her experience as SA. She didn't yet see it that way. Palmer did not appear to be surprised. 14 women have come to me about this, she said. She mentioned that Gaiman had slept with another babysitter during his first marriage and that she'd heard from other women who were disturbed by their experiences with him. Pavlovich waited until the end to tell Palmer about the child being present in Auckland. Afterwards, she recalled Palmer was silent. She appeared shocked. Palmer insisted that Pavlovich spend the night in her guest room. She told her, I've had to do this before and I can do this again. I'll take care of you. Pavlovich lay down in the bed and heard Palmer pacing back and forth in her room upstairs until 3 a.m. Palmer called Gaiman that night. According to Horn, the musician, she asked Gaiman whether their son had been wearing headphones while he and Pavlovich were in the hotel room. He replied no, then hung up. So he was very brazen about this. He was very bold and out and about with it. That's why him denying these allegations doesn't surprise me. Like, he just thought all of these people had way too much on the line to ever come after him, and he was so comfortable abusing them, doing these deplorable things because of that, because he knew that they were powerless against him. Following day, Palmer emailed Gaiman and their couples counselor, a man named Wayne Muller, a minister and a sort of marital companion, as he put it to me. According to Muller, who relayed the contents of the email to me, Palmer wrote that Gaiman needed psychiatric treatment and had finally agreed to seek it. Everyone was trying to make the best of what was clearly a difficult situation, Muller tells me. Muller should be on everybody's shit list too, because that's a mandated reporter and he didn't do shit. Palmer then flew to Edinburgh, where Gaiman was staying with their son. I actually wonder if being a minister grants him a religious exemption to the mandated reporter thing, which is probably why they were using him as a counselor, to be honest with you. Palmer then flew to Edinburgh, where Gaiman was staying with their son, whom she collected. Meanwhile, Pavlovich received a text from Gaiman. Amanda tells me that you're having a rough time and that you're really upset with me about what we did. I feel awful about this. Would you like to talk about it? Is there anything I can do to make anything better? Pavlovich didn't respond immediately. A reflex was to fix the situation, she tells me. The next day she wrote, hey, we'll speak soon. Hope you're doing good. In the days and weeks after Pavlovich's revelation, Palmer was solicitous, checking in frequently over text and sending warm notes. From the minute you entwined your fate with mine on Ponsonby Road, I've been glad I met you. That is tenfold so now. So she's doing a lot of damage control for this man because she's the mother of his child. She helped Pavlovich find a temporary apartment and invited her over for meals. In late March, Palmer sent a message to a friend of Pavlovich's, a 41-year-old ceramicist named Misma Anaru, in whom Pavlovich had confided about Gaiman. I'm glad she had you to take care of her, she wrote. It's been a rough month for everyone. Anaru's partner, Chris Taylor, was a doctor of psychology who had lectured at the University of Auckland on coercion, consent, and rape. Although Pavlovich had never used the words rape or SA to describe what had happened to her, both Anaru and Taylor believed Gaiman had... Sorry, I can't say the word too much, so sometimes I have to say graped her repeatedly. Anaru felt Palmer bore a share of the blame. Replying to Palmer, she wrote that the majority of my rage is directed at Neil. But she couldn't understand why, with all Palmer knew about Gaiman, she had sent Scarlett into that situation. Did you not see this coming a mile away, she added. And yes, I know you asked him not to do that to her, but honestly, the fact that you even felt that's something you should ask is fucked up in ways that defy comprehension. That's the only person in the story so far to stick up for an SA victim. Around the same time, Pavlovich followed up with Gaiman. I had a very intense dream about you last night, she wrote. Are you doing okay? In his reply, he made a reference to something that happened 2 weeks earlier. In a session with Muller, Palmer had said that Pavlovich was telling people he had raped her and was planning to Me Too him. I wanted to kill myself, he wrote, but I'm getting through it a day at a time, and it's been 2 weeks now, and I'm still here, fragile, but not great. He expressed dismay at Anaru's message, which Palmer had told him about. I'm a monster in it, he wrote, and Amanda seems to have bought it hook, line, and sinker. Apologizing for bringing any upset into Pavlovich's life, he wrote, "I thought we had a good thing and a very consensual thing indeed." So this is all gaslighting. This is all extreme manipulation. This is scary levels of manipulation. Pavlovich remembers her palms sweating, hot coils in her stomach. She was terrified of upsetting Gaiman. "I was disconnected from everybody else at that point in my life," she tells me. She rushed to reassure him. "It was consensual and wonderful," she wrote. "Anaru had been triggered by something, I think," she added. "I'm so glad you messaged me," Gaiman wrote. "I thought you were a monster." He thought she was a monster. And this is what I mean, like he sees women in black and white. Right? Gaiman asked Pavlovich to speak with Mueller. "Knowing that you would be prepared to say it's not true, it was consensual, he's not a monster, makes me a lot more grounded," he wrote. Mueller reached out to Pavlovich to offer a safe harbor. When they spoke on the phone, Pavlovich told Mueller what Gaiman, who was paying for the session, had asked her to say. After listening to Mueller's esoteric spiritual claptrap, she felt worse. "I really felt it was all my fault." Mueller, for his part, tells me that ethical boundaries prevent him from sharing anything about his sessions with Gaiman, but he apparently felt comfortable sharing details of his conversation with Pavlovich. That's because she's poor and can't sue him into oblivion. What she called to speak with me about was feeling pressured from very diverse, mostly older women in her community to take action that she wasn't sure she felt comfortable taking. I simply accompanied her on a journey to help her figure out the answers for herself to that issue. So he just helped to gaslight her away from the good advice that other women were giving her. And this is what men will do for their male friends. In the weeks that followed, Mueller connected Gaiman with the Austin Riggs Center, a psychiatric facility in Massachusetts. According to Mueller, Gaiman had several preliminary phone calls with the facility and was considering entering a 6-week inpatient evaluation process. But Gaiman never followed through. "I don't remember why not," Mueller says. He doesn't think he deserves to face consequences. Pavlovich grew suicidal. She hoarded Zapiclone and aspirin and walked around the city surveying bridges. She decided she'd take the pills and told Palmer about her plan. At Palmer's urging, she checked into an emergency room. "You are loved," Palmer texted. After a few days in a respite center, feeling slightly better, Pavlovich reached out to Palmer to ask if she could resume working as the child's nanny. The apartment Palmer had set up with was temporary, and she needed a place to stay. "It would be really good for me, I think, to have something to do and people to be around," she wrote. Palmer argued it was not the time for her to take on the responsibility of caring for a child. "Your job is to care for you." She proposed they get together when Pavlovich got out, promising to help her get back on her feet, and suggested in the meantime she go home to her parents. This infuriated Pavlovich. "There's a reason I have divorced my parents," she wrote. "I'm starting to feel very much on my own and like I hate everyone." "I can't offer you exactly what you want from me," Palmer wrote, "but I can still be here. Remember this." "Babe, I'm more alone than I've ever been in my life," Pavlovich replied. She wished she'd never agreed to be their nanny. "If I hadn't gotten on that first ferry, I wouldn't be where I am now." Like I said, these people don't care about you. They'll promise you the world, the sun, the moon, and the stars, and then they'll be like, "Oh, but it wouldn't be good for you." Like, what kind of place are you in to take care of a child? Top tier gaslighting. This is insane. At night, Pavlovich texted Gaiman. "Amanda keeps saying she will help, but it seems more philosophical, rather than actually like she will help." 2 minutes later, she added, "I've been thinking of you so much." Gaiman replied that he'd be happy to help in a tangible way. Pavlovich then received an NDA dated to the first night of her employment, when he had suggested she take a bath. She signed it. A month later, she received a bank transfer from Gaiman, $1,700 for her babysitting work. That's laughable, by the way. 2 months after that, she received the first of 9 payments, totaling about $9,200. Again, laughable. She worked for them for a long time. Over the course of that year, her perspective changed. As he faded away, I began to let other voices in, she says. Friends connected with her with women who were experienced in dealing with SA and abuse, including Zelda Perkins, a former assistant of Harvey Weinstein's, and an advocate for ending the misuse of NDAs to buy women's silence. Caroline and Pavlovich broke their NDAs when they spoke out about Gaiman. These women encouraged her to go to the police. In January 2023, Pavlovich filed a police report accusing Gaiman of SA. At the station, she gave a formal interview about the case. After she told the officers her story, one of them told her that Palmer's cooperation would be essential for the case to move forward. Pavlovich assured them Palmer would participate. I said to them, she's a public feminist and she knows what happened. She'll want to protect me. I'm sure she'll speak. When the police contacted Palmer later that year, she declined to talk with them. Gaiman never spoke with the police either, though he did provide a written statement. Whatever feelings Palmer might have had about the situation went into a song she performed on tour, one she wrote shortly after Pavlovich's confession. It was called Wakaniwa, named after a park near their homes on Waiheke. Another suicidal mass landing on my doorstep, thanks a ton. A few more corpses in the sack. You'll get away with it. It's just the same old script. The world is shaped to have your back. You said, I'm sorry, then you ran and went and did it all again. So she's very privy to what's happening here, and she knows she's powerless to stop him, but it still doesn't make it okay that she didn't speak to the police or speak out against any of this. Like, for real. This past fall, Pavlovich began studying for a degree in English literature at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. As it happens, the university had awarded Gaiman an honorary degree in 2016. In December, Pavlovich approached the head of the university, Dame Sally Mapstone, to share her experience and asked the university to review the decision to honor Gaiman. Mapstone was sympathetic but indecisive. Some on the board, she told Pavlovich, would likely want evidence of prosecution to rescind his degree. Like, what kind of evidence do they want? Do you know what I mean? Do they want videos of him, like, violently raping her? Because obviously there are no videos of that. Like, what kind of evidence? Like, that's so fucking crazy. As far as the police report goes, the matter had been closed because nobody spoke up. A spokesperson says, Gaiman's career, meanwhile, had been marginally affected. A few pending adaptations of his novels and comics had been put on hold or canceled. But the second season of The Sandman is set to premiere later on Netflix this year, as is Anansi Boys on Amazon Prime. He and Palmer are entering the 5th year of an ugly divorce and custody battle. Gaiman has bled her dry in the divorce proceedings, according to someone close to her. And that's why she's not going to say anything about him ever, because he can make that even worse. She's moved back in with her parents in Massachusetts. So, in December, Pavlovich flew to Atlanta to meet some of the other women who had made accusations against Gaiman. They had been unaware of one another's existence until they'd heard the podcast. Since then, they'd formed a WhatsApp group and grown close. It's been like meeting survivors of the same cult, Stout tells me. It's impossible to understand unless you were there. On New Year's Eve, Pavlovich, Stout, and Caroline gathered around a bonfire at the Athens home of the musician Michael Stipe, an old friend of Caroline's. Kendall joined them on FaceTime. With their dark hair and delicate features, they look like they could be sisters. So yeah, he has a type. Around 11 p.m., they wrote down their intentions for the year and cast the scraps of paper into the fire. Pavlovich had written that she wanted to release the yoke of victimhood and invite in self-acceptance. The next morning, she woke before the others made coffee, cleaned the kitchen, and sat on the porch in the winter sun. Am I happy? She wrote in her journal, no. But she also noted that she wasn't alone. There's no need to feel abandoned anymore. So that's it for the article. Now let's read his statement that he released. Just prepare to be gaslit, okay? That's the only thing I can tell you. This is titled Breaking the Silence. It was posted on Tuesday, January 14th, 2025 at 10:20 a.m. Over the past many months, I have watched the stories circulating the internet about me with horror and dismay. I've stayed quiet until now, both out of a respect for the people who were sharing their stories and out of a desire not to draw even more attention to a lot of misinformation. I've always tried to be a private person, not true, and felt increasingly that social media was the wrong place to talk about important personal matters. I've now reached the point where I feel that I should say something. As I read through this latest collection of accounts, there are moments I half recognize and moments I don't. Descriptions of things that happened, sitting beside things that emphatically did not happen. I'm far from a perfect person, but I have never engaged in non-consensual activity with anyone ever. I went back and read the messages I exchanged with the women around and following the occasions that have subsequently been reported as being abusive. These messages read now as they did when I received them, of two people enjoying entirely consensual schmexual relationships and wanting to see one another again. At the time I was in these relationships, they seemed positive and happy on both sides. And I also realized looking through them years later that I could have and should have done so much better. I was emotionally unavailable while being schmexually available, self-focused, and not as thoughtful as I could or should have been. I was obviously careless with people's hearts and feelings, and that's something that I really deeply regret. It was selfish of me. I was caught up in my own story, and I ignored other people's. I spent some months now taking a long, hard look at who I have been and how I have made people feel. Like most of us, I'm learning. and I'm trying to do the work needed, and I know that that's not an overnight process. I hope with the help of good people, I'll continue to grow. I understand that not everyone will believe me or even care what I say, but I'll be doing the work anyway, for myself, my family, and the people I love. I will be doing my very best to deserve their trust as well as the trust of my readers. At the same time, as I reflect on my past and as I re-review everything that actually happened, as opposed to what is being alleged, I don't accept there was any abuse. To repeat, I have never engaged in non-consensual sexual activity with anyone. It's giving I did not have relations with that woman. I had no idea. Some of the horrible stories being told simply never happened, while others have been so distorted from what actually took place that they bear no relationship to reality. I am prepared to take responsibility for any missteps I made. I'm not willing to turn my back on the truth, and I can't accept being described as someone I am not, and cannot and will not admit to doing things I didn't do. See, I wish this is what we thought more of as he said, she said, right? To me, it's like he just said this. Like, we have less proof that this stuff did not happen than we do proof that it did happen. This statement tells me that Neil still fundamentally, to this day, not only does not understand the concept of consent, but he is still like confused and disgusted by it. In fact, he is vehemently against the idea of consent, because here are women coming forward telling him, hey, what you did to me was actually not consensual. And the fact that you cajoled and convinced and basically pressured me into doing these things don't make it consensual. It makes it non-consensual. And here he is saying, I don't accept that. I don't accept that. So he's very well educated with consent on his side of things, right? He's like, I don't accept that. I don't want that. I don't believe that. But when it comes to women saying like, what you did to me was not consensual, he's like, that's not true. Sir, you don't actually have a say in that. They said it was non-consensual. That means it was non-consensual. You can like sit here and scream, cry, throw up about it all you want, but that's the fact of the matter, is that it was non-consensual. You, in fact, it seems like he had plenty of, ways to have consensual encounters. It seemed as though those were the only ones he was not interested in. He was not interested in the women that would be begging him to sign their breasts or giving him keys to their hotel rooms or asking if they could be his slave, like all these things. He was fine. He was like, no, I'm good. Instead, he would go after non-consenting women that he employed. That's what he gets off on. He gets off on non-consent. He's probably getting off on posting this statement and knowing that some people believe him and knowing that there are going to be women's comments covering the story, doing anything but believing women, because they know that if they had the chance, they would act in the same exact ways as Neil did. And they don't want to make it a precedent that men are going to get called out by other men for being a piece of shit. They want to set the precedent that women have to be perfect victims, that women have to come forward with evidence for every single time that they endured this kind of abuse, of which there obviously wouldn't be any. Like, what kind of evidence do y'all want? What's the evidence? It is so sick and twisted how men use bro code to protect abusers and powerful men whose goodwill they will never earn, despite showing the highest levels of submission. Neil Gaiman does not care about you fucking losers. He doesn't care about his own child, okay? He doesn't care about anyone in his life. And least of all, he cares about you stupid motherfuckers that are out here defending him like it's your rape and assault case. Save all that energy for when you are really gonna need it, because that's the energy that y'all are giving off. Just rapists and assaulters that haven't had a chance to act on it yet. I don't believe that there's much more to say after reading this article other than stay away from men, stay away from powerful men. And instead of investing in these kinds of quid pro quo type relationships that will never actually benefit you, go out there and invest in yourself. Don't let a man anywhere near what you have built. Learn from Amanda Palmer, who is now living back home with her parents. After everything that she tried to build for herself, this man still bled her dry financially and left her on the side of the road to rot. She's now living back with her parents. After everything that she's done to be independent and self-sufficient, he still took it all from her. And she now has to worry about their child finding out his father is a rapist and an assaulter. I don't think he's going to go to jail for any of this, but she now has to be worried about the kind of reputation that her child's father has in order to protect her child, who is probably already traumatized and fucked up beyond recognition. Thoughts and prayers for them, I guess. I don't know. Just know that anybody who is an outspoken, loud feminist is probably just not going to have your back. Like, I don't know how else to say this or explain it. I know it doesn't seem like it makes sense, but these are the kind of people, like, when they tout feminism for seemingly like no reason, you know, they're just out here saying it like left and right. It's because they're actually using feminism as a shield to protect themselves from rightful allegations. Like, oh, I couldn't have done that. I couldn't have said that because I'm a feminist. So I wouldn't have done that. Please be safe out there and stay away from these horrible fucking creatures. Love you so much. Godspeed.